Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another great edition of our San Jose State Writing Center Craft Talks. We have a special edition today because we're also joined by a member of our Read staff here on campus as we do our interview of Jeff Chon. Jeff is a local writer, and his debut book, #Good Guy with a Gun, is available now from your local bookstores. And he's also, this is breaking news, will be in the Best Small Fictions Anthology 2021. And let's introduce our Read staff as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sahar Bora, and I am the current archive director and staff editor for Read Magazine this year.
So Jeff, while we met in our creative writing nonfiction cohort in our MFA program, you've also published fiction, including, of course, this fabulous debut novel. What's different about your process, both writing and editing wise, as you work on an essay versus a story?
I honestly don't know how different the process is necessarily, but I do feel like you get different things, or you get to do different things, and you get different benefits from writing fiction or nonfiction, right? Because with fiction, obviously I get the benefit of stepping out of my own life, so to speak, although how much of that is really not my life, but a lot of that is you get to kind of step out and take on another person's life, for your own benefit, as somebody said, I forget who said that. And with essays, a lot of my essays were narrative essays anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So it feels like because of that, they felt kind of like first person, short stories a lot, in a lot of ways. Although there were, you got to play a little more with exposition in essays, obviously, and you can kind of not worry so much about scene work even in a narrative essay. Although the one thing I'm realizing now, or the thing I'm starting to do more and more, is I'm starting to bring a lot more of those essay type concepts to my fiction, so that my fiction, I'm the whole idea of getting rid of the scene work, well, not getting rid of scene work, but this, the scene work is slowly starting to blend a little more with expository writing. And I think that this novel was the one thing that where I started to realize that, oh, I could actually sometimes telling is showing. So it's been kind of an interesting process of learning that, learning to kind of merge the two a little more in my fiction.
Do you find that you can write your fiction while also working on essays, or do you need to have a little bit of separation, or because you're seeing that blend together, can you work on them sort of jointly?
That's a really good question. I hadn't thought about that really. I just kind of sit and do whatever strikes my fancy at the time. Richard Ford, by the way, he's the one who said that, taking on another person's life for your own benefit. All right, we got that out of the way. It just came to me. I don't know. I don't know if it's too hard to shift necessarily, but I am someone who has trouble compartmentalizing, when I write. So, if I'm writing an essay, it's not that I can't switch to fiction or switch to a short story because I'm writing an essay. It's because I need to finish that essay. I tend to get tunnel vision a little more than, when I'm writing. And because of that, it's a little harder to shift, I think. And more because of the tunnel vision than because of the shift in discipline, because, I'm starting to see that they're basically the same in a lot of ways, right? It's just one needs a little more fact checking, I guess.
I always like to fact check the life of Jeff Chon.
Yeah.
All right. So my next question for you, I've always enjoyed talking about books with you. Why is reading so important to you as a writer? And do you see any influences from other writers or pop culture in your work?
I think reading is maybe the most important part of writing, to be honest. It's like the whole idea of, if you're cooking something, you want to taste the things too, right? To make sure it tastes right. And I think you get that from eating other people's cooking, I guess. Is that a weird way of putting it? Weird metaphor. Let me try this again. Maybe there's this idea of, if you want to be a chef, you probably like to eat, right? There's a simple metaphor for you. Yeah, so I think that, reading is very important. And, something I teach students too, this idea of reading, close reading, looking at something on a page, and, why things work, what you like, right? And, what you don't like, and then, or why something doesn't work, right? These are things you learn from, reading, and I think that that was probably the, greatest tool I got from, the MFA program was, learning to read, learning to actually read something, right? In terms of reading for pleasure, I mean, we should just, reading is important because it's fun, right? I don't want people to get caught up in this idea of you should always workshop everything you read. And I mean, Maria, I'm sure you remember leaving grad school and then having to turn that part off. It took a long time to turn off this idea of workshopping things and just enjoying novels for the sake of enjoying novels. But, so reading is fun, which is why we should do it. It's great and useful. In terms of pop culture, I think pop culture has always been a part of my work. Even my essays, I think I use a lot of pop culture elements in the essays, because I think that that's kind of how I connect to the world in a lot of ways, right? Is, as a former teenage nerd, right? There was, I connect to Star Wars and, all these things like that. And, stuff like Spider-Man and Superman become metaphors. They become extended metaphors in my work in a lot of ways. So it does influence my work. The interesting thing, you asked if which books influence the way I write, or which writers or pop culture. During this pandemic, I've one of my coping mechanisms has been reading old X-Men comics from, my youth. Really going through, and, so I order them online and then just sit and just kind of devour them. And one of the things I realized was those comics actually influence a lot of the way I write. A lot of the storytelling techniques that the writer, when I was a kid, Chris Claremont, I use, right? Which is one of the things that he liked to do, was he'd give you a little bit of a tiny interlude in one, issue, and then you might not see that thing pop up again until like 4 or 5 months down the road. And I think this idea of planting seeds and braiding narrative and making things a little more like rhizomatic, right, is something that I probably learned from that, because I was looking through those things and I realized that as a kid that blew my mind when, you're like, why is he showing a cyclops on a boat, right? And then, like 4 months later, you're like, oh, that's why, right? It was just a lot of fun to connect those things. And I'm starting to realize that I really enjoy this idea of shared universes, not necessarily even Marvel type stuff, right? Which, not Marvel type stuff. How's that as an adult, right? Not the movies. But, I mean, Greek mythology, right? When I was a kid, I used to read a lot of Greek mythology. And, those stories are very interconnected, aren't they? When you really look at that. And, for me, it was a lot of fun to find the ways these stories connected. So I'm starting to actually branch out and do a lot of that. I mean, this novel actually features a lot of the minor characters in this novel are from short stories that I'd written in the past. So it's a lot of fun. And the short stories I'm writing now are actually connecting this novel to the other thing I'm working on. So I'm having a lot of fun, connecting things. And I wonder if comic books influenced me a lot more than, I'd like to admit.
I mean, that's an interesting point. I'm sort of thinking about, and you're going to laugh at me here, thinking about William Faulkner and like Yak Napatafa.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you see sort of like, are you hoping that eventually you're going to have like this community of characters that you're sort of following through the works of Jeff Chon?
I don't know. I mean, I'm gonna see where this goes. I mean, I could lose interest eventually and move on to something else. But right now, I'm liking this idea of, taking these characters and exploring them. Like, there's a character who, I showed as a teenage boy like 2, 3 years ago in a short story for the North American Review. I just wrote a short story where you get to see him in his 30s.
Hmm.
And then in the next novel that, in the novel, he's a minor character as a middle-aged man. So it's just, that's been fun. It's been a fun process, but, I feel like I'll eventually tire of it. But, right now I'm just doing I'm just going to go where it takes me and doing what interests me because, if I'm not interested in something, I'm not going to be able to convince anyone else, right? So let's have some fun.
Great. Why don't we go on to the question, some of the read questions.
I read an interview that you gave with Maudlin House recently where you talked a lot about this question of relevance and being too soon. So at Read, we talked about this question a lot as well, given that we had a theme of cliche. So I'm wondering, what do you mean when you say too soon? And how do you consider this question specifically when you look at work as a contest judge?
Oh, too soon. The thing I remember in the Maudlin House, I was talking about this idea of too soon in relation to like current events, writing about current events, right? This idea of like this novel, I started this novel around inauguration day. It was around the inauguration of that last guy, right? Are we allowed to say his name now? He's not Voldemort, right? Yeah, Trump, right? It was the Trump inauguration. I don't know why I didn't want to say his name. That's just weird. Anyway, people thought it was weird that I was writing this novel about the election right after the election. And for me, it wasn't about, it wasn't necessarily a novel about the election, but more about how we got here. All right. And I feel like that's something we could talk about because it was something that was years in the making. That was kind of what I wanted to talk about with exploring this idea of things too soon. And there's that old cliche, as we like to call, right, of where we say comedy is, what is it? It's the saying, comedy is tragedy plus time. Isn't that what the saying is, right?
Mm-hmm.
If comedy is tragedy plus time, then removing the concept of time, means we're just writing tragedies, right? So I don't really ascribe to the too soon thing because, we're all writers and, we all have a little bit of, either arrogance or swagger, right? And, we know that if we can, pull it off because we're good, if you're good enough, you'll pull it off, all right? Doesn't matter what you write about, if you can pull it off if you're good enough. I remember there was a guy we went to school with who, whenever someone would say in a workshop or in a craft class, you can't write about things like this. You shouldn't do this. You shouldn't do this in your writing. He would go home and write about it, because, he wanted to challenge himself. And I feel like it's very limiting to say things are too soon or things are overdone, right? Because I remember what he used to say when people said, it's been done is, well, I haven't done it yet. So, I think that's a lot of what that too soon thing was. I think a lot of people said to me it was too soon to write this. And then January 6th, when all those dummies were doing their thing, that's when the people who said too soon were texting me going, "Oh my God, can you believe this? You were right. We were wrong," which was an odd sense of vindication, amongst all the horror.
Yeah, I'm really interested by, the concept of time as being sort of an integral part to making comedy happen. So in that vein, how should writers kind of consider this question of, too soon and the concept of time as a part of their process? And does that kind of vary by genre, perhaps?
Um, hmm. I think one of the things I don't know if it's as popular as it used to be, but there was a trend for a while when it was still going on when we were in grad school, when everyone was writing in present tense,
Mhm.
right? And I feel like there's this people did that because there was this immediacy to it, and I think my one issue with present tense was I always wondered, how did we get here? And it was just here because the stories were, a lot of them were just, here we are, this is where I am, right? And for me, I'm always a lot more interested in how do we get here. So I feel like as long as you know how you got to this point and you can kind of convey that a little bit, then I think that it doesn't feel too soon, because that then it feels a little more earned, right? If the reader knows how we got here and why we're here, then these things feel a little more. I haven't said the word earned in so long. Those wonderful workshop terms, right? But
I mean,
I think that that's something to consider with time, right? This idea of it's not just about the present moment; it's also about you're bringing the past with you. So I think that's something we should really think about.
it makes me think that that's coming from your nonfiction training.
Oh yeah, that's probably true. I'm sure that a lot of that probably is a way of a little more of maybe how an essayist thinks, possibly, right? This idea of
The reflection. Yeah.
yeah, the reflection, the retrospective voice, right? Even in present tense, you should still, you know, there should still be a little bit of reflection, I think, that should come through, even if it's not explicit, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, I think this sort of leads into our next question. You and I, since we've known each other, we met in an MFA program, and we have a current MFA student interviewing you as well. What is the value? And we're thinking about this at San Jose State, where we have an MFA program that, we can all participate in and be a part of. What advice would you give to writers starting out or thinking about applying to graduate programs? How should they use their time as, they're thinking about starting to publish? And what's the importance of having that community of writers, the people that you workshop with, the people who read your work, who think about, your voice and your pieces all day long, every day for several years? How does that sort of, is that important to you as a writer still? Is that like how has having an MFA influenced you, I guess?
Um, hmm, that's a good question. I came to the MFA a little later, right? I think you and I both had lives before we came. We weren't. We didn't just go straight out of undergrad into the MFA. And for me, I just, the best thing the MFA did for me was, this idea of, like I said, reading, right? Learning how to actually read was really nice, and just knowing that, how to use this, to have the discipline to sit and write, which I, didn't have when I was, working, real big boy jobs before, going into the MFA. And I think the best thing about the MFA was that was it was a time when I was, given these 2 years to just sit and be creative. Right. And I think that, it was a great way to sit and learn, and a great way to make a lot of mistakes in a kind of a nice controlled environment, where it was a little more nurturing, right? Where you had people around you. But yeah, so it's something I still think about quite a bit, this idea of, wow, what could I do if I had 2 years to just sit, you know, now that I know what I know, right?
Mhm.
Go back. That's right.
Do you find having a community of writers still important for you, or are you more of a sit alone, think through my process myself kind of guy now?
Yeah, I feel like I've always been a think through by myself kind of guy. I mean, this isn't, we'll get to the community part after this. Don't think I'm not saying community is bad either. I've always been a sit through, and think things through by myself kind of guy, because I was the guy who would get questions like, isn't it too soon? Or, that doesn't sound very good, and a lot of that isn't, and that's not any sort of knock against, the people, the other writers I talk to. Probably a little more this idea that I haven't had the time to really sit and think things through enough. And because of that, I'm not very good at conveying what I'm trying to do. And it's one of my maybe deficits as a writer, is I've never been very good at selling my work. you know, what is it about? Because what I think something is about is always different. In terms of the community, I think it's very important to have a group of writers. I think we all, need that group of writers to bounce ideas off of, to, keep us honest, to, have work that we could look at, right? Because I know a lot of times we want to use writers to workshop our own stuff, right? But I think it's just as important to read someone else's work, right? Because, that's how you get to see, how these other, how people are breaking down their process, and, how they're using things. And, you get to pick things up, and it becomes, very mixed martial artsy, right? Where you're learning all these new skills, right? Maybe you're like, oh, I'm a striker and he's a grappler, right? And like, oh, this is how you grapple, right? Which is, just strikes me that maybe that's kind of what nonfiction and fiction is, right? Maybe nonfiction is grappling and fiction is striking. I don't know.
Would you count sort of the work that you've done with different literary journals, or, some of the different publications you've worked with? Do you count that as part of your community too? Has that sort of influenced, like seeing other people, seeing, some of these slush piles? How has that sort of changed the way that you think about your own work, or has it?
No, yeah, it definitely does. Yeah, the other group is, you don't like to backtrack, or not backtrack, but kind of circle back and say that, have people who don't have MFAs in your group too, which is always fun, because you read differently, right? It's a lot of fun. Just they don't say things like, oh, you wrote past the ending, right? Because they didn't, they weren't poisoned in that way the way we were, right? But yeah, I think definitely, slush has helped me, right? You look at slush and you get to see, sometimes it's just, sometimes one of the nice things about looking through a slush pile, and I'm sure that, I don't know if either of you have had this experience, is sometimes you look at something and you say to yourself, it's weird because I would think I always tell myself I'm never going to say this out loud, but sometimes you look at a story and you say, this would have been a lot better if I'd written it, right? And it's not necessarily because the writing is bad in that story. Sometimes it's a great story and you accept it. You just kind of look at things, and it just, gets you going, and you start to look at it and you're like, oh, I would have done this, right? Or this, here's what I would have done, even though understand that that writer made the correct choice, right? But yeah, I think slush has really helped me in a lot of ways. I'm a lot more patient, I think, with literary journals, because you know how tough it is, and how much you have to get through. I've recently become a little more I'd say kinder about bad writing, quote unquote, or writing that just does I just don't like. I mean, you start to realize that they're just, working stiffs like you, right? And that there isn't this kind of scarcity and they're not competition, which is, one of the things that I think a lot of younger writers do is they look at other writers as competition, and it's not. There's plenty of outlets, venues out there for you. So it's one of the things that going back and reading Slush now for Heavy Feather Review, which I do every once in a while. It's been kind of a nice thing going back after being such a having it have it was kind of a more of a high stress situation before, and now it's just a little more I'm just being helpful, which is kind of nice. And yeah, I think that the most important thing I got from this is this idea of not looking at other writers as competition, even though I just said that, oh, what would have made this better is if I wrote it, but that's not necessarily about them, that's about me.
I think all of that advice is really helpful to young writers starting out, thinking about, just focusing on your own work, really sort of, thinking about the community around them, using their time in a really wise way as they have that gift of years in a graduate program, if that's what they're doing. So all of that advice, I think, is really helpful for people who might be thinking about graduate work or just sort of starting out and trying to find their way in the writing community. So, yeah. We thank you so much for sharing your insights with us. As a reminder for folks, here's his book, #Good Guy with a Gun. You can pick it up in any bookstore. Enjoy it. It's got some great reviews, including my own that's coming soon. And of course, we also have your issues of Read coming up. And what date is the release date?
It should be hopefully by the end of May. It's issue 154 with the theme cliche, and we're really excited to share it with the world and, show what people's interpretations of the word cliche have been, both in terms of fiction, nonfiction, and some of the amazing art pieces that we've got. So definitely, pre-orders are now open on the website, readmag.org. So yeah, head over there and, reserve your copy.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeff, for stopping by. And I'm sure everyone will enjoy hearing this on our San Jose State YouTube station.